Welcome to Africa Geotrends, your window into Africa's power, progress, and geopolitics. Asterisk before we dive in, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the stories shaping Africa's future. Africa enters a new chapter in global technology, and this time it is not as a consumer, not as a resource exporter, and not as an afterthought in global supply chains, but as a rising producer in one of the most strategic industries in the world, semiconductors. What once seemed impossible is now materializing with real investment, real partnerships, and real geopolitical consequences. For the first time in history, Africa's role in the global chip industry is shifting because a new alliance between African nations and Gulf investors is transforming the continent into an emerging semiconductor power, opening manufacturing corridors that the United States, China, and Europe are watching extremely closely. Africa has long been known for producing the minerals used in chips: cobalt, tantalum, niobium, copper, platinum, and rare earth elements. But now Africa's ambition is no longer limited to supplying raw materials. The continent is working on capturing the most valuable part of the chain: chip design, fabrication, packaging, testing, and advanced electronics manufacturing. This shift began quietly between 2023 and 2025, when Gulf sovereign wealth funds, especially from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, started directing billions into Africa's digital infrastructure: data centers, fiber networks, AI labs, and industrial zones. These investments were not random. The Gulf states were positioning themselves as major non-Western players in semiconductors, and they recognized something that the rest of the world was still ignoring. Africa had the minerals, the workforce, the strategic location, the energy potential, and the future demand profile to become a natural hub for chip manufacturing. They saw the demographic advantage: a population projected to reach 1.7 billion by 2030, with the world's largest concentration of young engineers entering the workforce. They saw an electricity revolution unfolding through renewable energy: solar in North Africa, geothermal in East Africa, hydropower in Central Africa, wind across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coasts. They saw special economic zones expanding from Morocco to Kenya to Rwanda to Egypt, each with competitive tax regimes, port infrastructure, and manufacturing corridors aligned with global supply chains. By 2025, this vision accelerated when several African countries publicly announced semiconductor industrial strategies. Morocco became one of the earliest leaders, leveraging its automotive and aerospace manufacturing sectors, strong industrial zones in Tangier and Casablanca, and partnerships with Europe and the Gulf. Egypt entered the race through its economic zones around the Suez Canal, where companies were encouraged to set up chip packaging and testing lines, supported by Gulf-backed manufacturing funds. Rwanda launched a national semiconductor program tied to its growing tech innovation ecosystem and the Kigali Innovation City project. Kenya accelerated its plans through Konza Technopolis, positioning it as East Africa's microelectronics hub. South Africa reactivated older semiconductor research programs and began partnering with Gulf investors to modernize its microchip capabilities. Nigeria, with its massive youth population, announced semiconductor training initiatives aligned with its new digital economy policies. But the biggest catalyst, the moment the world began paying attention, was the formation of Africa Gulf semiconductor partnerships funded by multi-billion-dollar investment pools. These funds were launched by the UAE's Mubadala, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, and Qatar Investment Authority, all of which had already invested heavily in global tech giants. Now, they were strategically placing capital in African industrial zones, drastically reducing Africa's entry barriers into a field long dominated by a handful of powerful nations. The Gulf states understood that the semiconductor industry was shifting toward distributed manufacturing due to geopolitical pressures between the U.S. and China. With both superpowers seeking alternative, less vulnerable supply chains, Africa represented neutral territory with massive growth potential and access to critical minerals essential for chips. This created an unexpected three-way dynamic. The United States saw Africa's semiconductor rise as a potential opportunity to diversify away from East Asian manufacturing. China saw it as a strategic necessity to protect supply chains from Western pressure, and the Gulf saw it as a way to position themselves as brokers of the next technological era. Africa suddenly found itself in a position it rarely occupied, not as the one chasing partnerships, but as the one being courted. The semiconductor race is not just about manufacturing. It's about economic sovereignty. For decades, African countries exported raw minerals for pennies while the countries that refined and manufactured electronics captured trillions of dollars in value. A kilogram of cobalt or exported from the DRC might fetch a few dollars, but once processed into battery components or chip-grade materials, its value skyrockets. A ton of silica sand in Namibia might be cheap, but once transformed into semiconductor-grade silicon wafers, it becomes one of the most strategic industrial materials on Earth. Chip fabrication requires precision, cleanliness, and expertise, but the raw components, especially rare earths, tantalum, niobium, and cobalt, overwhelmingly come from African soil. Africa already sits on over 30% of the world's critical minerals. This became a strategic advantage the moment the continent decided to leverage it. Gulf partners realized that controlling mineral supply was only half the game. Controlling manufacturing was the real prize. Meanwhile, Africa realized that the only way to escape the resource trap was to move up the value chain. And so the two sides aligned. Gulf capital plus African minerals and workforce equals a new semiconductor frontier. But why is the world nervous? Because the chip industry is the backbone of global power. Every smartphone, every car, every missile system, every AI model, every satellite, every drone, every medical device, and every supercomputer depends on chips. Control the chip supply, and you control the future. This has been the center of U.S. China tensions for a decade, and now Africa is stepping onto that same battlefield, not as a pawn, but as an emerging power. China has already invested heavily in African mining, ports, and telecommunications, but the U.S. has been trying to reshape its Africa strategy around securing critical minerals for clean energy and advanced tech. Both powers are aware that whoever Africa partners with on chips will gain a long-term, strategic advantage. As soon as Africa announced semiconductor industrialization plans, diplomatic traffic increased. Delegations from Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Seoul, and Tokyo began visiting African capitals to discuss semiconductor cooperation. American companies proposed building chip packaging plants in East and West Africa. South Korean companies explored African partnerships for fabless chip design. European companies offered training programs, digital labs, and manufacturing equipment. China expanded its advanced technology agreements through Belt and Road partnerships. Africa suddenly became the location where global rivals had to compete through investment, not pressure. And the Gulf played a crucial role by bringing credibility, financing, engineering expertise, and geopolitical neutrality. With Gulf funds backing African manufacturing zones, the continent gained the financial stability needed to attract international semiconductor partners without losing sovereignty. Africa began insisting on rules. No more deals based solely on extraction. Instead, all semiconductor agreements must include local training, technology transfer, value addition, research centers, or manufacturing facilities. This shift represented a new model. Africa is no longer the raw material supplier of the world. It is becoming a technological participant. The rise of chip manufacturing also began transforming Africa's education sector. Universities in Morocco, Egypt, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, and Nigeria launched new microelectronics and semiconductor engineering programs. Gulf-funded scholarships brought African students into advanced chip design programs in Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Doha. Technology zones across Africa created microfabs for training, research, and prototyping. AI labs and robotics centers emerged to complement semiconductor ecosystems. Africa's youth, often underestimated, began filing global patents, creating semiconductor startups, and contributing to open hardware development. Meanwhile, industrial zones that were once focused on textiles, car assembly, or general electronics were upgraded to support clean rooms, advanced manufacturing equipment, and chip packaging lines. Morocco's industrial parks integrated chip testing facilities into existing automotive supply chains. Egypt's Suez Canal Economic Zone attracted Middle Eastern electronics firms willing to build packaging plants close to European markets. Kenya's Konza Technopolis began attracting semiconductor research companies building AI hardware optimized for the African market. Rwanda positioned itself as a training hub, focusing on chip design and prototyping. South Africa leveraged its engineering legacy and scientific institutions to dive deeper into research and development. Another factor fueling Africa's semiconductor rise is energy. Chip manufacturing consumes enormous electricity, and Africa's renewable capacity is booming. With solar farms across the Sahel, geothermal fields in Kenya, hydropower across the Congo Basin, and wind corridors along the coasts, Africa has an opportunity to build green, low-carbon semiconductor facilities, something that Europe, the U.S., and Asia are pushing for but struggling to meet. African nations realize that clean energy is not just an environmental asset, but a competitive advantage in attracting semiconductor companies. A low-carbon fab built in Africa could become one of the world's first climate-aligned chip facilities. The transformation is not occurring without challenges. Semiconductor fabrication is one of the most complex industries on Earth. It requires specialized expertise, supply chain stability, ultra-clean facilities, and long-term investment. But Africa is not trying to build 3-nanometer chips overnight. The continent is starting with packaging, testing, and mid-range chip manufacturing, an extremely valuable segment that serves automotive, telecom, medical, industrial, and consumer electronics markets. Over time, Africa plans to move toward more advanced manufacturing, just as China, South Korea, and Taiwan once did. As Africa steps into the semiconductor world, a geopolitical realignment unfolds. The United States sees Africa as a counterweight to China's dominance in minerals and manufacturing. China sees Africa as essential to its global tech supply chain. Europe sees Africa as a stable neighbor capable of powering its green and digital transition. The Gulf sees Africa as the continent of the future, an economic frontier ready for industrial transformation. Africa sees itself as a rising power, no longer defined by external interests, but shaping its own technological destiny. The global semiconductor race is no longer just an Asian story. It is becoming an African story. And as Africa builds fabs, trains engineers, signs multi-billion-dollar agreements, and moves up the value chain, the world is realizing that the continent they once underestimated is now entering the most strategic industry of the century. This is Africa's semiconductor moment, powered by minerals, youth, ambition, and new alliances. It is a moment that signals the end of Africa's role as a raw material warehouse and the beginning of Africa's rise as a technological force shaping the future of global power. You've been watching Africa Geo Trends, where Africa's moves shape the world. If you haven't already, subscribe now and stay ahead of the next big story.